Today I'm going to show you how to knit a bow headband using a circular knitting machine. I love this pattern. It's quick, easy, and they just make me smile. Before we begin, I want to give a big thank you to my friend Miriam, who so beautifully modeled the headbands for this video. I'm going to show you every step of the process today, but if you'd like to support the channel, you can purchase a printable download of the pattern linked in my shop below. And I also want to give a big thank you to my viewers who purchased my patterns. It's a huge help in allowing me to continue putting in the time to develop my patterns and film and edit these tutorials. I'm going to show you how to make these headbands in a size small, medium, and large, and I'll also share how to knit an extra large bow. Keep in mind that tension varies from person to person and yarn to yarn, so I want to encourage you to knit up a sample headband to see how the sizing works for you. You might end up wanting to make them a little smaller or larger than my samples depending on your yarn and tension. If you make this project, please tag me on social media when you share your work at Diana Levine Knits on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Pinterest. There are so many ways to customize these headbands. You can make the bow smaller or larger. You could add an embellishment to the front of the bow. You could knit the bow in a different color from the headband, or you can use a different color for the center of the bow. Here's an example of a two-tone bow, which I think would work really well for sports teams, dance teams, or gifts where you want to use school colors. All the sizes measure approximately 3 inches tall. The small size measures about 8.5 inches wide, the medium measures about 9 inches wide, and the large measures about 9.5 inches wide. In terms of timing, this is a pretty quick project. It takes me about 20 minutes to knit the pieces and about 10 minutes to seam and assemble the headbands, for a total of about 30 minutes per headband. That being said, we all go at different paces, so the project time will vary from person to person. I have lots more fun, quick, and easy patterns coming soon, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date when I release my latest videos. And if you'd like to check out my knitting machine books, templates, and patterns, visit DianaLevineKnits.com. The techniques I'm going to walk you through today include casting on and off of a knitting machine, seaming the ends, assembling the bow, using the mattress stitch, and adjusting the size of both the headband and the bow. All the supplies I'm using today are linked in the description below. For this project, I'm using an Addi 22 needle machine, or you can switch this out for the Sentro 22 needle machine. I'm using Loops and Threads impeccable yarn in the colors Red Hot, Arbor Rose, and Soft Rose. You'll also need a crochet hook and a darning needle, a tape measure, and if you'd like to include one, a knitting tag. Step 1 is knitting the main piece of the headband. Cast onto a 22 needle machine using scrap yarn that you'll be removing at the end of the project. Wrap your yarn around the first needle and then weave the yarn front and back along the needles until the end of the row. When you reach your first needle again, place your yarn into the tensioner. Hold the yarn in your hand to provide tension. Turn the knob to begin knitting. Start slowly for the first couple of rows and then you can slowly begin to pick up speed. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. When you finish the 5 rows, cut the scrap yarn and throw it in the middle of the machine. Switch to your main color, making sure to leave a long tail, which we'll be using to seam the headband later. Place the yarn tail right next to the scrap yarn tail and hold them close and low as you slowly begin to knit the next row. For the small size headband, knit 155 rows. For the medium size headband, knit 160 rows. For the large size headband, knit 165 rows. And if you'd like to make the extra large size bow, knit 170 rows. In this video, I'm knitting the size small. Keep in mind that these headbands will stretch a bit over time, so when choosing your row count, I would err on the side of smaller rather than larger with your sizing. When your work starts to touch the table, bring it up inside the machine. If you're using a regular table like I am today, you'll need to do this a few times throughout knitting the piece, and after a while, you'll need to roll the work to keep it in the center. When you finish your main color rows, cut a long tail in the main color and throw it in the middle of the machine. Switch back to the scrap yarn and place the yarn tails together. Hold them close and low as you slowly begin to knit the next row. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. When you finish 5 rows, cut a short tail in the scrap yarn and continue knitting until the work falls off the needles. Pull the work out of the machine and gently unroll the work and stretch out the stitches. Put the work aside for now while we knit the next piece. Step 2 is knitting the center of the bow. Cast onto the same 22 needle machine, again using scrap yarn in the same process as earlier. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. Switch to your main color yarn, leaving a long yarn tail. For all sizes, knit 20 rows in the main color yarn. When you finish up 20 rows, leave another long yarn tail and switch to the scrap yarn. Knit 5 rows in the scrap yarn. When you finish 5 rows, cut the yarn and continue knitting until the work falls off the needles. Pull the work out of the machine and gently stretch out the stitches. You'll now have 2 pieces of knitting that are ready to assemble, the main piece of the headband and the center of the bow. Step 3 is seaming the sides of the tubes. You'll notice that both pieces have open sides of the tubes. The next step is to use a crochet hook to seam the sides closed. Bring the sides of the tube together, lining up the stitches on top of each other, with the 2 yarn tails all the way to the left side. Make sure that when you arrange the stitches, there's 1 stitch all the way to the right that's perpendicular to the rest of the stitches. Bring your crochet hook under that loop all the way to the right, and then pull through that stitch that's to its left on the top side. Then pull through the stitch that's to its left on the bottom side. Continue in this pattern, pulling through the next stitch on the top, followed by the next stitch on the bottom, until the end of the row. When you reach the end of the row, pull the yarn tail through. Your side is now seamed. Next, remove the scrap yarn by unwinding it around and around the work. Then repeat the same process on the other side of the work and remove the scrap yarn. For the side that's more difficult to remove, identify the top length of yarn running through the stitches and remove that length a few stitches at a time until the end of the row. After that yarn is removed, the rest of the yarn should pull off much more easily. Next, repeat the exact same process on the sides of the smaller piece to seam the sides of the center of the bow and remove the scrap yarn from both sides. We now have 2 finished and seamed pieces of knitting. For the small size, the full length of the headband before assembling is 31.5 inches. The medium and large sizes will be longer. The length of the center of the bow is a little less than 4 inches long. Step 4 is assembling the headband. Lay the headband out horizontally. Fold one side in. This section should measure 3.5 inches wide. Then fold the other side in. This section should also measure 3.5 inches wide. If you're making the extra large size bow, make the folded sections wider at this point in the process. Fold the bow sections as wide as needed in order to keep the headband size approximately 8.5 to 9 inches wide. Alternatively, if you'd like a smaller bow, make the folded sections smaller. Keep in mind that if you choose to do a smaller bow, you'll need to knit less rows overall, so you don't end up with a headband that's too large. Then pull both sides together. When the headband is folded, the bow section should measure 7 inches wide. For the small size, the headband should measure approximately 8.5 inches wide. When folded, this is how the headband will look at this point in the process. Next, we'll be seaming the bow to the headband. We'll be seaming together the 2 sides of the exterior area of the bow to the layer below them, and we'll also be seaming the 2 headband sides together. Step 5 is seaming the headband. Thread one of the long yarn tails onto a darning needle. Begin by threading through one side of the bow to the back of the bow. When you place your stitches on the back of the bow, make sure you're threading over the interior bars between the stitches to create a seamless look. Make sure you're not seaming horizontally over the V-shaped stitches. Next, thread the needle through to the back of the bow all the way to the back of the bow on the other side. Then thread the needle back through to the top of the bow on the front. Repeat the same process again, threading through the first side of the bow to the back, and then threading the needle through to the back of the other side of the bow, and then back to the front of the bow. Continue in this process, pulling together all the sides until the end of the row. As you work, take care to make the stitches look clean on the back of the bow, but you don't need to worry too much about the stitches on top of the bow because we'll be covering that area with the center of the bow later. When you finish the row, you'll have yarn tails on both sides of the work. At this point, use a darning needle to bring both tails to the center of the work. Then tie both yarn tails securely with a few good knots and weave in the ends. When working with knitting machine tubes, it's very easy to hide your ends. Just thread the yarn through a few inches into the work, trim the tail, and pull the work to bring the ends into the center. Here's how your headband should look now. The bow sides should be attached to each other, and the headband itself should be closed and wearable. At this point, I like to remeasure, and I'll find that my headband is still about 8.5 inches wide, and the bow is about 7 inches wide. Step 6 is assembling the center of the bow. To create the center of the bow, we'll use the mattress stitch to seam the sides to each other. Thread one yarn tail onto a darning needle and thread the needle through 2 interior bars on one side. Pull the yarn through. Then thread the needle through 2 interior bars on the other side and pull the yarn through. Continue until the end of the row to create a small tube. Normally, I put a lot of emphasis on creating a clean seam. However, for this piece, you really don't need to worry about this particular seam looking perfect, because it will end up on the inside of the work and it won't be visible, so just a quick seam will be fine. When you finish the row, tie the yarn tails together in a few good knots to secure the ends. Step 7 is seaming the center of the bow around the headband. Turn the headband inside out. Place the center of the bow on the inside of the work with the seamed side facing towards the headband. Pull the sides together on the inside of the headband. Thread one of the yarn tails onto a darning needle. To seam the sides together, thread the needle through both sides of one of the V-shaped stitches on the top and pull the yarn through. Then, thread the needle through both sides of one of the V-shaped stitches on the bottom side and pull the yarn through. As you work, pull the yarn fairly tightly to create a secure seam. Continue in this pattern, alternating between top and bottom stitches until the end of the row. You'll now have 2 yarn tails. Secure these tails with a few good knots, making sure to place the knot on the side of the center, not on the top of the center, to avoid the headband having a knot on the side that will rest against the person's forehead. To weave in the ends, thread the yarn tails onto a darning needle and thread them through horizontally across the center of the bow. Then turn around and go back the next row over. I usually do this about 3 times and then I trim the tail. Repeat this process with the second yarn tail. Turn the headband right side out. Step 8 is adding a knitting tag. This part is optional, but I like to add a knitting tag to all my work. For this pattern, I really like using the skinny knitting tags because the side area is pretty small when the headbands are folded flat, but a regular size tag will work fine as well. At this point, if you prefer the bow to stay flat against the headband when it's worn, you can stitch the bow to the headband to keep it in place. Or, for the look in the photos shown earlier, you can keep it unattached. Our bow headband is complete. If you make this headband, please tag me on social media when you share your work, at Diana Levine Knits on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, and Etsy. If you'd like to support the channel so I can continue developing and sharing my patterns, please consider purchasing the printable pattern in my shop linked below. If you'd like to check out any of my knitting machine books, templates, and patterns, visit DianaLevineKnits.com. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a like, comment below, and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date when I release my latest patterns and videos.